So I would like to ask everybody to bear with me just for a second while I get a bit of background information about my story out of the way, because my story doesn't make sense to me unless I do have a bit of background information. I would also like to preface my story by saying that it is extremely difficult to articulate my story, not necessarily talk about it, but articulate it for various reasons. One of those reasons being that technically everything is over. Technically everything has come to a close. And over the past year, I've tried my hardest to distance myself from everything that has happened and focus more on my future than my past. Also, my story is fairly long and extremely convoluted. And I often found out about stuff that was happening to me years after the fact. So there is no real timeline to it that fits well in my head. Even when stuff was going on, I often blocked it out, pretended it wasn't happening, and didn't listen to the people that wanted to talk to me about what was going on. And then the final reason is actually something that I think I'd like to get to in a couple of minutes, because it kind of encompasses a larger idea to my story for why it's difficult to articulate it. My story is also fairly particular because my parents were never actually together. They were never married. There was no common law, and hence no separation. Instead of separation, what we got was 19 years of high conflict court battles with over 100 to 150 court appearances, 8 trials, 10 to 20 case conferences, et cetera, et cetera. Now, just because I didn't experience the separation of my biological parents, I did most certainly experience separation. In fact, when I was only a couple years old, everything had already started between my mother and my father, my biological mother and father. And when they had started their legal proceedings, it's ironic because my father actually ended up marrying one of his first lawyer's legal secretaries. And I'll be honest, it was wonderful when they got married. I had everything I could ever want. I had a huge house, huge family, brother, sister, lots of pets, all the toys I could ever want. But to top it off, the thing that wasn't so great about it was the domestic violence. Now, to give my story the initial kick that it needs, we can imagine 2 5-year-old boys sitting in a room on a couch watching TV, trying to drown out the noise of their mother, my stepmother, screaming, yelling, kicking, scratching, drawing blood, throwing things, breaking things in a bloody rage, crying, etc., while my dad sat there laughing. That was one of the main things I remember from being very young, is them fighting and my father laughing while they were fighting, saying to her that, look at yourself, you are unfit to be a mother, you're crazy, etc., which obviously didn't help the situation. And it doesn't need to be said that that relationship didn't last. And I got my first real experience of what the legal system can do and what impact it can have on people. So when I was about 7 or 8, they ended up filing for divorce. And while there are a lot of moving parts to this next part of my story, I can kind of explain it again with a tiny little story. So when I was 7 or 8 with my stepbrother, we ended up having a little play date, a supervised play date. And at the end of it, my stepmother was supposed to come and pick my stepbrother up. And I went downstairs against everybody's wishes because they had told me I could not go downstairs and see her. I went against everybody's wishes. And I wanted to go see this person, my stepmother, who had been a huge part of my life for many, many years. And I wanted to give her a big hug and say hello because I hadn't seen her for many months because the divorce was underway. And instead of being hugged back, I was greeted with a theatrical woman who was crying, pushing me away, telling me I couldn't see her, to get away from her, turning her back to me. And I didn't understand what was going on, only being 7 or 8 years old. Later on, I found out that my father had actually filed for a restraining order against her, and she was currently potentially about to lose custody of her children. She was being deemed unfit to be a mother, like always. And she was probably scared to lose her job, her life, her everything. And I also later found out as well that part of the reason why the restraining order was in place was because she had falsely testified against my mother in court. And she had admitted that she had been berated by my father, blackmailed by my father, and she was scared for her life. And so she testified against my mother, basically deeming her, my actual mother, unfit to be my mother. And for many, many years, my mother almost lost custody of me many, many, many times. And this is where I get to also explain that final reason at the very beginning for why my story is a little bit difficult to articulate, because during this time, everything that was going on, I was getting told one thing by my mother, another thing by my father. I was getting told things from one side of my family, completely other thing from the other side of my family. I was getting told things from old family friends about my mother and my father. I didn't know what to believe. I didn't know who to trust. My father kept comparing my stepmother to my mother, saying they were both unfit to be my mother, saying horrible things about both of them. And to sum it all up, I was basically just a very confused and angry child who needed a lot of counseling. And I did get some. And I ended up actually having some school counseling. The problem was when this school counselor found out that there were legal proceedings going on, she refused to see me anymore. And she didn't allow me to take part in any of the sessions and get any help. So I was technically on my own once again, being a very angry and confused kid. My life started to feel like a series of manipulation, stressful dramas, all this stuff. And because I was getting told so many different things from so many people, I didn't know what to believe. I couldn't focus on any of the specifics. Any specific details of my story were a jumbled mess in my head. They were unreliable. They were inconsistent. And anyway, that's that. So while I was struggling with losing my family, my actual mother and father hadn't stopped their legal proceedings. And I began to see more and more patterns. I couldn't focus on any of the specific details. Of course, like I said, everything was a mess in my head, but I could still reliably know what I was feeling and the patterns that I was seeing. So one of those patterns was that I started to realize that my father blamed everybody and everything around him. Every woman in his life was a crazy, maniacal, abusive, unfit for motherhood, cruel, addicted to something or another, evil person. And of course, that's what they tended to focus on when it came to the court proceedings. But I always knew, and this is a fact, I always knew from a very young age that I had a half brother. And I recently found out that I may have more than one half brother. I may even have a half sister. I don't know, but I definitely know I have at least one half brother. Him and his mother actually left and jumped the country, left the province when he was only about 11 years old to get away from my father. And this is something that I always knew about, and even my father didn't deny. And every few weeks, that was just kind of to give me another pattern of everything that was going on, everything that he was saying, plus the fact that this has happened at least once before, started to give me the idea that I was starting to get a little scared of my father already. And every few weeks, my mother would come to me stressing out about how my father could possibly know something about her life. There was some little detail that he had brought up, apparently, that he knew about, that he shouldn't have known about. And I started to realize, again, another pattern was that I had told him tons of information about my life, always, throughout my entire life. And it turns out that he had been taking this information and putting it in affidavits and serving my mother for almost the entirety of my life. Any information that I told him, he would ask me questions such as, how's your mom's boyfriend doing? And I would respond, oh, he's actually doing really well. He got a new gig at work. He's sleeping over. And of course he would twist and turn that into, now I had a stepfather who was common law with my mother, and he is now helping pay for my education. So he doesn't need to pay as much in child support. He doesn't need to pay as much for my education, obviously, because now I have a stepfather, apparently. Basically, at this point, I knew what parent alienation was. And this is when I'm about 12 years old, maybe even a bit before that. I began to become very, very aware of this fear that I had of my father, and that I couldn't say anything to him. He would constantly tell me that I was being alienated by my mother. But the funny thing was that he was actually pushing me further and further away from him. When I was 13, I was in high school, and I decided I had had enough. This was too much for me. This was too much for me to handle, of being stuck inside the two of them in the court system, not knowing what to say, what to think. And I didn't want to have to drive out to him all the time, because he always lived very, very far away from where most of my life was. So I decided I was going to stop seeing him. And of course, that was not okay with him. His weekends were his weekends, no ifs, ands, or buts. I had been alienated by my mother. She was twisting my thoughts, poisoning me against him. Our relationship had always been perfect, obviously. He loved me very much. He had always been there for me. I was constantly getting all these things told to me from him. I was wrong and he was going to tell me how to live. I cannot dictate my life to him. He was going to tell me how I was going to live. It does not matter what I believe because I'm wrong. He used to use words like I'm cruel, I'm abusive, I'm immature, I'm not thinking straight for wanting to see him. I had to grow up. I had to stop acting like a child. And I started getting ultimatums about it's his way or nothing. He started threatening again to take away child support. He started threatening to take away my RESP, my education money. He started threatening with court because he could afford it. He was very well off, and my mother couldn't. And of course, I started getting letters from my grandparents, other parts of my family, telling me that I was abusing him. The same old stuff, basically. I was abusive. I was not respecting him. I need to respect him. He's my father. I couldn't ask for a better father. They started blaming me for the fact that he had a heart attack. On my birthday, I opened up a letter from my grandmother and I burned it because it was basically my grandmother just accusing me that I had hurt my father, given him a heart attack. It was all my fault. And ended up burning that letter. So bye-bye evidence for court. But when I was 15, I had finally had enough. I blocked him on everything. And then I started going to court with my mother. If not just to support her, it was also, of course, to show him that I was no longer going to be his little manipulation toy under his control. And at least that's how I felt about the whole thing. Not to mention, it was also not only about just my mother anymore. He had always brought stuff up to me about taking away child support, about taking away my RESP, things that greatly affect not just my mother's life, but my life. So in my eyes, I always saw that as it doesn't just involve my mother anymore. Now it involves me and my mother. So I was just supposed to watch when I was first introduced to going to the actual courtrooms. I was just supposed to watch. And of course I didn't. I sat in a case conference with my mother, my father, and a judge, all present, and I ended up interrupting the judge at one point. And she was very respectful of the fact that she just sat there and listened. In fact, she listened for 50 minutes. I spoke for 50 minutes. And at the end of it, she congratulated me. And she said that she never heard someone so articulate, and I encourage, a bunch of flattery stuff. But I was basically told that I do not have to have a relationship with my father if I do not want one. And I thought I had finally made a difference in not just the legal part of things, but in my father. I spoke up against him. He tried interrupting me at many parts of my story. I basically told him to shut up. The judge told him to shut up and listen to what I was saying. This is your son, listen to him. So everything felt like it was going right. I was instructed at that point, actually, by this judge that I am now to come to all case hearings. Everything legal oriented, I was supposed to be there for. And she said, you are to be there for because your voice needs to be heard. But then, of course, over the next couple of months, I was told by him again, no, that's not what the judge said. The judge said you need to have a relationship with me, or else I'm allowed to take your child support away and your RESP. And again, I didn't know what to think because I'm getting told contradictory things constantly throughout my entire life of what's true and what isn't. And he threatened to take us back to court again. Of course, he did. And when the next one came, it was a completely different judge than the first one. Now, of course, that's okay in a lot of situations, probably for the better in a lot of situations, because the judges don't know much about what has happened prior. There's no conflicts of interest, etc. I get that. But the next time that I showed up, she told me that it was inappropriate for me to be there and I was not to be there for the case conference. This didn't involve me. Doesn't have, like, I'm not supposed to be there. It's basically what she said. But I said no. I said I was instructed to be there. My mother and I both went and told her, no, this is what we were told. I am going to be here for the next case conference, for this case conference. She allowed it until it came to until it came to the money aspect of things. I'm a kid, probably 16, almost 17 at the time. I don't need to be there for that. I get it. The problem is with that is everything that involved my relationship with my father at this point had to do with money. Everything. It was all that we talked about. It was all that mattered. And I got kicked out for the the money part of things. I kept getting kicked off whenever it came to money. So I was told that I actually had to have a relationship with my father, and I had to show the court that I needed a relationship with my father. And so our relationship devolved not just into money talk, but into basically empty invitations that both of us knew neither of us would be able to fully accept and go to. So we'd start telling each other we should go for dinner. We started sending emails to each other, saying we should go for dinner here, we should go for dinner there, you should come over, et cetera, et cetera. It would never happen. We were both too caught up in our own lives. It was all empty. Admittedly, there was always a part of me that wished that I would have had a relationship with him in some way, but there was too much bad blood by this point. And my father used to do these things as well. Sorry for a lot of information, but my father used to do this as well, where he would always make sure whenever he communicated with us that it would be on a date where we either wouldn't be able to respond because we were away on holiday. It was a birthday party, like my birthday party, for example. He would always serve us on my birthday, or he would send me an email asking for information about my life on my birthday, right before we were about to go on holiday. So we'd be thinking about it the entire time that we were away. So we would never be able to just enjoy anything. And when I was 16 or 17, I decided to get my own lawyer. The problem was, like I said, everything at this point was money related with him. Everything in our relationship was money related. And she said she couldn't really help me. She was there for me, but she couldn't really help me. And that was all right. Eventually, instead, I ended up getting a bit of a cathartic release from joining Youth Voices, an attempt to share my voice. And it worked for a while, of course. It's been great working with everybody at Youth Voices. But that brings us to my 19th birthday, where my mother and I walked to our front door, and leaning against our front door was a letter informing us that we had just been served to go back to trial. My 19th birthday. It was a very good birthday present. That night, my mother started suffering PTSD symptoms. I had to help her out, comfort her. I started stressing out as well after helping her. I had people to lean on. I had my girlfriend back then to lean on, and she had her friends and family to lean on. But we still always felt like nobody got it. Nobody understood it. No matter how much they were there for us, nobody could really understand what we were going through. And I wasn't myself for a solid year. I sat in my room, wanting to escape from the world. I dove into schoolwork, into actual work, into the legal stuff, trying to learn as much as I could about our cases. But ultimately, I just thought that nobody could really, truly understand or help us either. I didn't think anybody could help us or understand us. But eventually, it was too much for us, and we ended up getting a lawyer. And we settled for about a quarter of what child support should have been based on the law and based off my father's income. To this day, I still have to send him all my grades and my letters of enrollment, telling him what my grades are, telling him what courses I'm taking, even though we barely have any contact. And when we do, it's not kind in any way, shape, or form. But other than that, we have found some peace of mind. My relationship with my mother has never been better. My grades have never been better. My work has never been better. My social life has never been better. My health, all of it has been better. But to this day, we are still just waiting to find another letter at our door that's going to take us back to court. And that fear never really goes away.
I guess maybe before I start my story, I should just let everyone know that Jared was actually prefacing my story by including a little bit in his, because we have very similar, I guess, types of fathers. And the difference, I guess, with my situation is it was more high conflict. So there was a lot of different types of abuse involved, including physical abuse. So there's obviously a lot of traumatic experiences and emotions, as you can imagine. So I've actually written mine out in some sort of like key points just to help guide me and keep me on track with sharing my story with you. All right, so where do I even begin? I guess from a very young age, I was able to feel when I was in danger. And by this, I meant that I could tell the difference between those who genuinely cared about me and those who did not. So I knew what felt right and wrong. During my parents' divorce, my father accused me multiple times of being brainwashed, and he used legal authorities to silence me. Police, lawyers, counselors, and even school authorities who I thought were there to protect me, who I thought I could trust to take action, they didn't listen to me. It was difficult to ask for help when my choice, opinions, feelings, emotions, everything, it just wasn't validated by those who had the power to make a difference. And I was told to exclude myself from the conflict happening between my parents. But I just happened to always be there when the police came and forced me to go back to my abusive father's house when I had an asthmatic attack. I was there when my father's lawyer showed up to my school and called me out of class. Class. I was there when my classmate unknowingly handed me a threatening letter delivered from my father. I was there when the counselor tried convincing me that my father was a good person. I was there when my father's sister bruised 3 of my ribs and put me in the hospital. I was there when the police arrived only after I jumped out of my father's moving car and chased it down the street to rescue my brother when he tried to kidnap us. So for 10 years, I was there, but no one really listened to my cries for help. And despite all of this, my voice wasn't there. For me, I experienced a legal system that said to leave children out of it. But when I did get caught in the crossfire, nobody did anything to help me. I remember my father bringing multiple strangers into the house to interrogate, abuse, and berate us. They did just enough as to not leave a lasting mark, but their words still scar me to this day. Long ago, I heard the term "in the child's best interest" countless times, and I got curious as to what it meant, so I searched it up. Each factor that was taken into consideration included the resources of what each parent had to provide. For example, some factors I remember included the mental well-being of a parent and the willingness of each parent to allow access to the child. For someone like my father with sociopathic tendencies, narcissism, money, and legal knowledge, the legal system became a playground for my father to take advantage of. The result of his legal manipulation was 10 years of me fighting for my freedom. So for years, I thought, what about the well-being of the child? What about the child's willingness to stay with each parent? Ironically, nowhere on the factors used to decide a child's best interests did it include my choice, my opinion, feeling, or emotion. But how do you really know what another person feels without asking them? That's a question that I've always thought about. When I was a child, I could feel what was going on around me, even without knowing the full situation. I had instinct of whether I could trust someone or not and feel safe with them. So when I was silenced as a child, I felt my thoughts, feelings, and emotions were invalidated. And because of this, there came a point in my life where I lost my sense of identity, self-esteem, and purpose. But little did society know that they were doing much more harm than good by silencing me. And this is exactly why I'm here today, still fighting for change. I have a mission that one day children will have a choice, a voice that will be heard, and a legal system will not be able to ignore them. And I can confidently say that because people like me who have been through their parents' high conflict divorce are survivors. And I mean it when I say survivors, and we won't give up until there is change. Having a voice and using it is what fuels me to this day. I will never forget what it felt like to be weaponized by my father's grudge towards my mother. Because of my individuality, or to him, disobedience, I was punished by my teachers, counselors, and peers. He manipulated the people who were supposed to be my support system by saying that I either had a mental illness or was being brainwashed by my mother. So no one believed me. Having lost my friends, my freedom, my sanity, and my voice, my father took the last thing I held on to, my hope. Because of my father's manipulation, I experienced unforgivable interactions with lawyers, social workers, police, counselors, and the school staff. My experience opened my eyes on the level of impact that these people were able to create on my future. They were the ones who had the power to influence my mental and physical well-being, and they chose to turn a blind eye and see my situation through my father's tainted lens. Because of that, I faced unconscious bias from social workers who formed opinions based on my father's point of view. I was not advocated for because instead of listening to me and conveying my message, they delivered my father's message instead. And because of that social worker's message, I was sent back to my user for another 3 years. I faced uncertain police who didn't know who to listen to, the child who dialed 911 and ran away from their abuser, or my father's lawyer who showed up with a court order. When I was screaming and crying, asking for help, I was shown a piece of paper as if it was an arrest warrant, as they opened their car door to drive me back to my father's house. I always thought it was interesting how lawyers and judges who had a direct impact on my life were the farthest away from me. They heard about me, they saw me in photos, but I was never really given a chance to meet them. And back then, I wondered if they knew how many lives they've ruined before they even started. How I wish a judge would have stepped down from the pedestal and talked to me face to face, person to person. I was so sure I could have helped that judge make that decision in my best interest. And at one point in my life, I didn't know if tomorrow was going to exist. I didn't know what was going to happen. Everything was out of my control because of a court order, a piece of paper that dictated my life and said that despite all the physical, mental, and verbal abuse I faced, I was still forced to see my father. Was I going to have my ribs broken? Was I going to be locked in the house? Would I be able to see my friends? What strangers would come over and abuse me now? I faced a lot of uncertainty and anxiety, but coming out of this experience, it made me a lot stronger. But today, I'm still angry, I'm still persistent, and I have a lot to say. I don't think any child should have these thoughts, and no child should have to endure this kind of abuse for 10 years. My goal is that no child will ever be silenced again, and I'm driven by this need to make a difference for when my generation have children. Because to me, children are the future. And that's the end of my story.